The Lunatic by J.P. O'Brien. By now, my neighbours and I had become convinced that Ethan was crossing over from harmless everyday eccentricity into legitimate insanity. We already knew that he harboured a strange fixation on the moon. He would never fail to remind us what point of the lunar cycle we were in whenever we crossed paths. And he could often be spotted out in his unkempt front garden in the dead of night, lying amongst the wildflowers, meditating, doing yoga or dancing, in various stages of undress. Recently, he had even begun leaving bowls of water dotted around his property, which were apparently meant to collect the moonlight or something. But strange as these behaviours were, none of them really affected us, and as good people, we were generally tolerant of such idiosyncrasies. One or two of us had even been prepared to indulge him when he insisted on adopting a new name, Lunaris Moonshadow. Some of the others were particularly tickled that this allowed them to call him Loony, both behind his back and to his face. But our approach of living and letting live, which had always proven to be invaluable having Ethan as a neighbour, was now being put under terrific strain. There he was, standing up on top of his house, smashing a hole in his own roof with a sledgehammer. It had been a peaceful Sunday morning in our pristine little cul-de-sac when a disruptive noise brought all the neighbours out to their respective front gardens. In our pyjamas and dressing gowns, we now stood watching with incredulity, flinching as each subsequent sledgehammer strike rang out. Ethan himself seemed totally oblivious to the alarm he was causing. He would occasionally stop and squint up to the bright sky, shade his eyes with an outstretched hand, and mutter to himself as he calculated some angle or other before returning to work on the hole. I hurried across my own lawn in bare feet. By the time I reached his house, immediately next door to mine, I found it necessary to shield my face from the cloud of dust and debris that was raining down. "What are you doing up there?" I shouted to him, trying to sound harmlessly intrigued rather than panicked. He peered over the edge of the roof at me and shouted back, "Oh, hey Chris. I just needed to get this part of the roof out of the way. I'll be done soon. I apologise for the noise. Sorry, everyone." He sounded matter-of-fact, even rational. Then, a few seconds later, the head of his sledgehammer came crashing down again. Several of the other neighbours had congregated on the pavement at the edge of Ethan's front garden, but were cautious not to get any closer. They began murmuring and scoffing to each other. I overheard them wondering who was going to call the police first. Then again, Ethan was only destroying his own property. They weren't sure that was necessarily a crime. Carol, the elderly lady who lived in the house directly opposite Ethan's, had come over in her flowery cardigan and her hair still in curlers. She called up in a sweet voice, "Is there anything we can do, dear?" "That's okay, Mrs. Stone," came the cheerfully abrupt reply from the roof. Then bang! Another smash. I tried again. "Ethan, buddy, Loony," I overheard some faint sniggering coming from behind me. "What is your roof in the way of, exactly?" He rested the handle of the sledgehammer against his thigh, then wiped a few beads of sweat from his forehead with a flannel sleeve. "Got a good one tonight," he shouted with a hint of excitement. "It's the sturgeon moon." We waited for him to go on, but he appeared to have finished talking. I heard the neighbours behind me begin to confer once more. They spoke in low voices, even though Ethan was no longer paying us any attention. "Is he endangering himself, I wonder? What a bloody nutbar. Maybe we could make a noise complaint. I think we should call a doctor. Or a priest." There followed yet more derisive laughter. Carol Stone and I exchanged a disheartened look. Ethan, meanwhile, was kicking his heel at the edges of the hole he had made. Some defeated tile pieces fell through it and into the room below with a tinny clatter. Through the window, I could see his bedroom was filled with dust. I had only been his neighbour for a year, having moved into the house beside his in the aftermath of a bad breakup, but our neighbourly friendship had always felt warm. His unpretentious ease with life lifted my spirits in those first few months, and more than offering simple, superficial cordialities like everyone else, his words seemed to brim over with genuine sympathy. He didn't appear to be constrained by the rules the rest of us follow. From the start, I liked him. But then, once I had picked myself up and was beginning to get out of the house in a more meaningful way, socializing, returning to work, dating again, it was as if I suddenly recognized that his behavior didn't seem to fit. As if the best thing for me was to surround myself with a different caliber of people altogether. Before long, I would wait until the coast was clear before leaving my house. I had no need for him anymore. Ethan descended the ladder that leaned against the edge of his roof, his sledgehammer clasped in the crook of one elbow. All of us were still engrossed by his every move, but he didn't seem to notice. When he reached the ground, he propped the tool against the wall and made towards his front door. "Hey, buddy," I said, almost in song, as I hurried forward to stop him from going inside. He turned towards me, smiling amicably. "I'm not totally following. Mind just telling me what you're up to again?" "Well, I realised that part of my roof would be blocking my view," said Ethan. "Tonight is going to be the sturgeon moon, and I wanted to be able to sleep underneath it." "I don't think you need to make a hole in your roof, though. What will you do when it rains? What about when there isn't a sturgeon moon anymore? Are you going to be able to put your roof back the way it was?" I looked up, knowing that the structural damage had already been done. I tried to keep a neutral face as I pictured Ethan calling a repairman, explaining what precisely had caused the hole. But Ethan appeared genuinely puzzled by my question, as if I had instead been asking him why he wasn't setting his shoes on fire. "I don't want to put it back," he said. "I want to be under the sky. What's a home for if not to feel free inside?" He glanced at the rest of the neighbours as they stood and gawked in a fascinated line along the pavement. I was as dumbstruck as they were. Carol Stone wandered over to us and placed a compassionate hand on Ethan's arm. "Why don't you sleep outside instead, dear? That way your roof will still be there when you need it. That's what I would do." I nodded enthusiastically, grateful that someone else had stepped in to help. "That's the spirit, Mrs. Stone," Ethan replied with a beaming smile. "That's actually a wonderful idea." But he appeared to be staring straight through both myself and Carol. I looked over my shoulder to see what had drawn his interest, and noticed the tall oak tree in the corner of his garden. A little later, once Ethan had put away his ladder and sledgehammer and everyone else had gone back to their homes, the neighbourhood was peaceful once again. I, however, had been pacing in small circles around my living room, regularly glancing out of my front window to make sure Ethan wasn't getting up to no good. Whatever he was doing, it remained out of sight. The silence of inactivity was abruptly broken when Ethan's front door swung open and a dusty bed frame began lurching forward on its side and out into the open air. Halfway through, it stopped, and a moment later, Ethan himself climbed ungracefully out of the adjacent living room window, then resumed dragging the cumbersome wooden frame from the front end in a fit of grunts. By the time I had sworn under my breath and burst through my own front door to catch him, he had already dragged the bed 2/3 of the way across his front lawn and was now pulling it up to the foot of the oak tree. In its wake, it had left a trail of crushed grass and skid marks all across the soil. A not insignificant portion of the front garden's growth had become lodged between the joins of the wood. "Chris, perfect timing," Ethan chirped, before I could get any words out. "I wonder if you could help me. I need to get this bed up into the branches. It's quite a bit heavier than I remember, and I've still got to get the mattress too." "You need to what?" He rubbed his chin, considering the problem. Well, I thought about putting it down here, but I think up in the tree would be— Ethan, just stop! I exploded, surprising even myself. This is not normal. Ethan's wide, sunken eyes stared into mine. He looked like a wounded animal all of a sudden, but I couldn't keep myself from going on. You're being absolutely ridiculous, totally irrational. You can look at the moon whenever you like, but why do you have to smash holes in your roof? Why do you need to drag your bed outside? Why on earth does it need to be up in the tree? You have to think. By now, I was visibly shaking. I exhaled deeply, trying to regain some of my composure. At last, my better judgment caught up with me, but my true feelings had already poured out and were now hanging heavy in the air between us. Ethan didn't move a muscle. Quietly, I spoke again. I'm sorry, you're going to do some damage to yourself. We're concerned that you're taking this too far. Just as I was speaking on their behalf, several of the neighbours began peering through their front curtains at us. I'm sorry, I repeated, before I returned home, leaving Ethan standing beside the upturned bed frame in his overgrown garden. As the afternoon wore on, I drifted about my house restlessly, replaying the confrontation in my mind. The uncharacteristic eruption weighed excruciatingly heavily on my conscience. I attempted to busy myself in the kitchen to avoid the temptation of looking out of my front window. I was far too embarrassed to get involved anymore. I pulled everything out of the cupboards and wiped down all the surfaces, then returned everything to its place again, but all I could think of was Ethan's helpless, childlike expression. I was about to start mopping the floors when I noticed a folded piece of paper sitting on the mat below my front door. My pulse quickened as I gathered the note and opened it up. I have to disagree with you. It is normal to want to be outside, to be connected to the world. Gazing up at the night sky is calming, freeing, awe-inspiring. As Henry David Thoreau wrote, it would be well, perhaps, if we were to spend more of our days and nights without any obstruction between us and the celestial bodies. If the poet did not speak so much from under a roof, or the saint dwell there so long. Birds do not sing in caves. I'm sorry you don't see it this way. Your neighbour, Ethan. In front of the word neighbour was a word which had been scribbled out. He had first written, but then evidently decided against, friend. The note was a gut punch. Its eloquence was a startling reminder that Ethan wasn't a child to be yelled at and corrected. He was a perfectly capable grown man. His passion for wanting to feel connected to the world was valid, admirable even. But at the same time, he still seemed to be implying that he was right. That destroying his roof, attempting to put his bed in a tree and tearing up his front garden, that all this was a normal course of action to take. He was unable to see to the contrary, and the dissonance left me astounded. Feeling the pin-prickles of hot shame in my cheeks, I dragged myself over to Ethan's front door to try and smooth things out. My knock was timid. I looked around his messy garden and saw the bed frame had gone back inside, but the tracks all across the grass from its brief sojourn out of the house remained. Finally, Ethan came to the door. Hey, I said. Look, I'm really sorry for yelling at you. I read your note and, well, I think I see your point. He gave me a nod, but said nothing. I glanced down and saw that there was a pile of heavy climber's ropes just inside his door. For a split second, I imagined him attempting to rig his bed up in the tree before falling and breaking both his legs. I tried to ignore it. But with that being said, I went on, I do think we should try to come up with another way for you to look at the moon that isn't quite so extreme. Speaking as your friend. I mean, what's wrong with a good old chair? I forced an uncomfortable chortle, which crumpled into a knot in my throat. Ethan didn't seem too impressed. He exhaled, then raised his hand slowly to the edge of the door. "Listen, I'm a bit busy. We'll talk another time." And with that, he quietly closed the door and clicked it locked. I retreated to my home with a profound sense of loss. I felt that we would, in all likelihood, not be having a real conversation again. Despite his earlier excitement about the Sturgeon Moon's anticipated appearance that night, I did not see him emerge from his house again for the rest of the evening. During the next 2 weeks, there was plenty of evidence to suggest that our once warm neighbourly friendship had already disintegrated. On the occasions when I happened to see him coming or going from his house, I would hasten outside and try to intercept him, hoping to strike up a conversation. But it was only ever me doing the talking. Our roles from the prior months had totally reversed. When I shared the details of the situation with several of my friends in the pub one evening, clasping at my hair as I did so, they assured me that Ethan had been the one who failed to recognise a helping hand, and that I was not out of line. They were perfectly content to dismiss him outright. "From what you've told us," one of them pointed out, "it doesn't seem like he even has a job. Or friends." "Yeah, I wouldn't worry so much, Chris. I don't think you're missing anything if he keeps to himself from now on." But, allowing everything they had said to turn over in my head as I walked home that night, I couldn't help but disagree. Contrary to their interpretation, I actually did feel I was missing out. I knew Ethan was a good person. Then, in the 3rd week, I became acutely aware of what I had failed to notice. I had been rummaging around in my garage and came across a box of my ex-girlfriend's stuff. It had migrated over when I moved in. As the pain of dealing with it was too great at the time, I just stashed it and ignored it, until I forgot about it. But finding the box again gave me an unexpected clarity of how I had wronged Ethan. I realised that I needed to try and meet him on his own terms. Maybe I was beginning to feel the pull of his madness, or maybe I was actually waking up. I researched the name and significance of the next full moon, the so-called harvest moon, and waited for the night to come. By the time it rolled around, I had become disconcertingly anxious about what was to unfold between us. His unceremoniously closing the door on our friendship had been torched into my mind, and I had no reason to believe that he was ready to forgive and move on just like that. At dusk, I gathered my courage and knocked on his door. When he opened it, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me and waited. "I wanted to say again that I'm sorry," I began, "but genuinely sorry. I was projecting things onto you that actually had nothing to do with you at all. Well, I've been thinking about it a lot, and there's something I'd like to share. Seeing as tonight is the harvest moon, and in the spirit of reflecting and letting go of burdens, I wondered if you'd like to join me outside to look at it, and I'll tell you what's on my mind." It's amazing how someone's eyes reveal their true feelings if you look closely enough. As he stood there in silence, his expression hardly changed a jot. He was clearly still deeply upset with me, and I wouldn't have blamed him for wanting to carry on in that manner. But in his eyes I saw a spark. Sure enough, he briefly looked down to the ground, trying to conceal a smile, before looking up at me again and nodding. "All right, it's a deal," he said. "Give me an hour to get something ready. Don't come out until I knock." Walking back across our gardens to my place, I was a little unnerved by his words. I was convinced that I was going to come out to see his bed frame tearing up his front garden again, or something even worse. But, making a determined effort not to be judgmental about him from now on, I pushed it out of my mind to just wait and see what followed. Back home, I collected a few things for the two of us. A couple of folding lawn chairs, a 6-pack of beer, some snacks, and put them ready by the door, then waited for his knock. A little under an hour later, he invited me to come and see what he had done. Now hanging from the tree were several lengths of the heavy rope, expertly looped and tied around the branches and leading almost all the way up to the top. He had turned his tree into a climbing frame watchtower. "What do you think?" he asked. "I gave up on trying to get the whole bed up there, but sitting in the tree and peeking through the leaves gives a fantastic view anyway. It blocks everything else out." Before I had even answered, he reached for the lowest hanging rope and, seemingly without any effort at all, hoisted himself onto a branch about halfway up the tree. He turned to look down at me like Tarzan. I eyed the rope uncertainly. "I think I'll be a bit happier on solid ground instead," I said. "As you prefer," he replied with a boisterous smirk, before climbing the rest of the way to a perch near the top. He found a groove for his back against the trunk of the tree and sat with his legs dangling over either side of a branch, then waved down at me. I unfolded one of my lawn chairs on the grass below and took a seat. "So," called down the voice from above me, "what's on your mind?" For a moment, I didn't want to answer. Our respective seats were some distance apart, and I wondered if this was the best forum for the sensitive conversation I intended to have. Then again, the neighbourhood was beautifully still. There was a gentle sound of chirping crickets, and the faint yellow light coming from the front of Ethan's house illuminated the underside of his tree. It seemed otherworldly against the pitch-black sky. Meanwhile, the full moon was beginning to come out for her performance. I felt at peace. I opened a beer for myself, then looked to see if I could get one for Ethan. He waved his hand dismissively. "I had a revelation," I called up, easing back into my chair. "I realized what I was actually upset about when I yelled at you. Remember Tilly? Well, after we broke up, my world was completely upended. You remember how much I was struggling. I was fighting for some normalcy because I had just lost all of mine. I was being forced to confront how fragile my normal actually was. I think I was terrified of the alternative." Ethan peered down from his branch and pursed his lips together, but he didn't speak. "Anyway, that day I thought I was helping you," I said, "by guiding you away from something I deemed to be crazy. But the other day I finally worked out that was not my responsibility. For the record, I don't think you're crazy. And I know that the line between craziness and passion can be thin. But it doesn't fall to me to say where someone else's line is supposed to go. Anyway, I'm deeply sorry. Not just for yelling at you, but for trying to change who you are." We sat in silence for a moment. I watched a small cluster of midges hover below one of Ethan's front lights. "Society has a way of quietly expelling those who don't behave normally," he eventually said. "But where does that concept of normal even come from? It comes from society." "Yeah. But societies are varied too. What's normal to you might seem insane to people on the other side of the world. So why isn't looking to the moon for guidance valid? The moon has been here longer than any society." I thought about all the cultures in human history that had placed such importance on the moon, the stars, and the night sky, and took a sip from my beer. The bottle made a deep plunk sound as I lowered it again. "When you came to apologize to me," he went on, "it wasn't that I didn't want to accept your apology. I think you're a good person. But I thought you were apologizing for the wrong reasons. You were still convinced that I needed to fit your way of thinking, but that's not how the world works." "Yeah, I get that now." "All right, well, in that case, I accept your apology." "That simple?" I asked, surprised. "You see?" he grinned. "The moon is more powerful than you think." "You may be right about that, Looney." We sat out under the night sky for several more hours, sharing stories and philosophies, and rebuilding our friendship. In that time, I realized how valuable a friend Ethan truly was. He was exactly the caliber of person I needed to have in my life. That night, I also learned the value in observing the moon once in a while. After all, it had been watching over me this whole time. I just wasn't looking up. You have been listening to JP O'Brien's stories. For more, visit patreon.com/JP O'Brien Stories.